I'm standing next to a legend, okay?
This guy should not be allowed to talk about fighting.
I disagree.
Certainly don't claim to be the aficionado you are or anybody else covering this sport, but excuse me.
I was upset at Stephen A. Smith.
Joe Rogan, if you need me, you know where to find me.
Joe Rogan and Stephen A. Smith are arguably the largest personalities in all of sports. Joe Rogan with the UFC and the biggest podcast in the world, and Stephen A. Smith is the highest paid commentator at ESPN and is very respected when it comes to football and basketball. Joe Rogan and Stephen A. Smith are both very opinionated people, and that has got them to their success today. So what happens when you put these two together? Well, by no surprise, you get a disagreement. This is when Joe Rogan and Stephen A. Smith got into a public dispute. So this all started with Conor McGregor versus Donald Cerrone at UFC 246. It was January 18th of 2020, and Stephen A. was named on ESPN's broadcast team to cover the fight. So if you didn't already know, MMA fans aren't the biggest fan of Stephen A. covering the sport, so they weren't really happy about this announcement. And well, Stephen A. didn't let those people down. After Conor McGregor stopped Donald Cerrone in the first round in only 40 seconds, Joe Rogan and Stephen A. Smith were expected to do ESPN's post-fight coverage together.
20 seconds.
Stephen, stunning? Is that even, can you say from Conor McGregor it's a stunning win?
Listen, I'm shocked and disappointed. I thought Conor McGregor would win this. I thought he would take him out in 2 rounds.
As Stephen A. breaks down the fight, watch how Joe Rogan tries to hear him out. Even though he disagrees with him, he doesn't interrupt him once.
Cowboy Cerrone's been knocked out 6 times in his career, the last 2 times, so I knew he had a questionable jaw, so I expected it to end in round 2. I didn't expect it to end in 40 seconds, or as you just said, Joe Rogan, the first 15 seconds was like shadow fighting, for crying out loud.
After Stephen A.'s rant, Joe doesn't really address anything he says, and he gives his explanation of how he thinks the fight actually played out. Now, it wasn't long until Joe Rogan and Stephen A. Smith came to a disagreement. Once again, both of these guys are very opinionated people, and they both debate people regularly, so this was almost destined to happen. As Joe Rogan is talking, Stephen A. interrupts Joe and says something that just shows he doesn't know anything about the sport, and he shouldn't be here covering one of the biggest fights of the year.
We haven't learned a damn thing about Conor McGregor based off of this fight.
Really?
Because who were you? Listen, the man did not get hit other than 1 kick to the arm. That's it. I mean, he didn't. Listen, I have gotten hit that much in the last week.
Now, Stephen A. pretty much goes on to say, because the fight ended so quickly, we didn't get to see if Conor McGregor has improved from his last fight. And he also called Donald Cerrone a quitter, who, if you don't already know, is a veteran of the UFC.
Cowboy Cerrone had a reputation for not stepping up in the big moment, but he's never been a champion. They talked about that. This was his first pay-per-view event ever.
He said it was the biggest fight in his career.
So here's what I'm thinking. The lights might have been too bright, Joe.
Now, Joe Rogan was trying not to disagree with the face of ESPN for the entire interview, but had enough of Stephen A.'s lack of sympathy for Donald Cerrone and his overall lack of knowledge of MMA.
Ran for 40 seconds.
I disagree. We learned he rises to the occasion. We learned he could put Cowboy away.
Now, Stephen A. quickly submits to Joe's rebuttal.
This was his return, and it was a pretty significant return.
I could stand corrected on that.
Because even though Stephen A. is typically a stubborn person, he realizes that he's out of his element and that Joe Rogan is more knowledgeable in this field. Fans would even leave comments on the video saying, "Joe's smiling at this guy being a clown the whole time. How does Stephen A. Smith keep getting work, especially in MMA? There's so many past fighters who could be there instead and give some actual insight." So things didn't end here. Joe Rogan would later go on his podcast and would make fun of Stephen A. Smith's boxing training.
First of all, someone needs to explain to me what's happening here.
Yeah, well, it looks like a punch to the left.
Look how low he's punching. This guy should not be allowed to talk about fighting.
He would also address the disagreement they had on the Donald Cerrone-Conor McGregor fight.
Look, I don't know jack shit about baseball. I don't know jack shit about basketball. I literally don't even know the rules. I don't know when people foul people. I'm not sure why. I don't know what's happening.
No.
I know MMA. I understand it. So if you want to talk about MMA, I'd like to talk to MMA about someone else who knows MMA. There's a lot of currency in being a Stephen A. Smith. You know, he's really entertaining. that shit talking that he does, he's a guy that's fun to watch. He talks a lot of shit, he gets real loud, and everybody disagrees with him.
And Joe didn't stop there. He went on a 10-minute rant on why Stephen A. Smith isn't good for the sport of MMA, and why he shouldn't be covering a sport he doesn't know anything about. He also goes on to say how he hates sportscasters who talks down on athletes, and how commentating MMA and commentating football and basketball are two totally different things, because in MMA, you could lose your life.
He always falls apart. That guy, that needs to give his money back. He sucks. He this and that. And the other guy's like, oh, I can't believe you're saying that. And you can do that in sports radio, and people love it. I hate that. This sport demands a different perspective. It's not the same thing as a ball going into a hoop. No. It's not the same thing as crossing a line with a football.
I think Joe Rogan was mostly upset at Stephen A. calling Donald Cerrone a quitter, who is a legend of the sport. And because once again, this is the biggest fight of the year, and he is forced to cover the fight alongside someone who doesn't know much of the sport, when there are other people who are experts who Stephen A. Smith is taking that opportunity from.
If you don't know what you're talking about, and you're talking about it in front of millions of people, like, man, that's a bad look for everybody.
Yep.
It's a bad look for ESPN, it's a bad look for him, it's a bad look for the sport. It's like, there's other people that can do this.
Now, it didn't take long for Stephen A. to hear Joe Rogan's podcast, and he would post this video to his social media.
Me, Stephen A. Smith, me being at the Conor McGregor fight against Cowboy Cerrone, saying what I said, that he didn't show us much in 40 seconds, that warrants. It's not good for the sport. It's not good for me. It's not good for ESPN. First of all, as it pertains to ESPN, check the numbers. Certainly don't claim to be the aficionado you are or anybody else covering this sport, but excuse me, I have been a reporter for 25 years. I have covered sports on a variety of competitive levels, regardless of what the sport is. That includes boxing and the UFC.
So honestly, I don't hate Stephen A.'s response video. I mean, for the record, Joe Rogan did go on the most popular podcast in the world and pretty much trashed him for 10 minutes straight. So I do understand why Stephen A. Smith felt like he needed to make this video. Stephen A. pretty much stood on everything he said. He thinks Joe Rogan is still wrong, and he even said he would be willing to sit down and discuss their issue in person.
I'll state it next week, next month, next year. I stand by that. And I don't think disagreeing with that position warrants the kind of criticism that came in my direction. Having said that, you're entitled. You have your right, just like I have my right to respond, as I'm doing right now. But anytime you want to talk to me about this fight, or you want to talk to me about my credentials to discuss something in the world of sports, name the time and place, Joe Rogan, I'll show up.
So you would think that this would be the end of their beef, but Joe Rogan didn't drop it there. He saw Stephen A.'s response video and would address it on his next podcast.
I was upset at Stephen A. Smith. He made a video responding to me. Stephen A. Smith, I guess I should respond, right? You're a very entertaining guy, but you're wrong. So Stephen A. Smith responded, and then Conor responded. And
I seen that.
Conor told him to apologize.
Yeah.
That is correct. Conor McGregor also got involved, and he tweeted this to Stephen A. Smith. The call you discuss here is A+. I didn't show enough. I'm not paid by the hour, though. Joe's comments, however, come from you saying the opposition fighter quit. Broken nose / orbital bone say different. Fighting is vicious. Those who make the walk deserve full respect. Apologize. Joe Rogan would continue to double down on his previous statements that he feels Stephen A. shouldn't be commentating any MMA fights.
I just think that this sport demands more appreciation, more respect, and it demands a higher level of reverence to the athletes who literally put their lives on the line.
So as of October of 2022, Stephen A. Smith and Joe Rogan have not gotten into any public disputes and haven't even mentioned each other on social media. And at the end of the day, these are two guys who do have respect for one another. But nonetheless, this is what happens when two of the biggest stars in their respected fields clash on live television. And if you enjoyed this video, watch this video next.